listen to Xi Jinping. He has tremendous hubris, and his commitment to communist ideology is unshaken. He's talking every day in China about 勿忘初心. Don't forget that your original commitment. What is the original commitment? Basically, is the communist ideology.
Mao Xu, chief China strategist in the State Department during the Trump administration, unpacks China and the Communist Party.
The Chinese communist, Marxist Leninist commitment to that kind of ideology to make China the leading force of the ultimate triumph of global socialism. America is a country of consequence. We're the country that was most generous whenever there is natural disasters in the world that occur. And the world has to have the United States at the forefront for freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, for joining Zoom in China today.
My pleasure.
You talked about this new strategy that the Trump administration has developed. I was wondering, is that a whole of government a strategy to deal with China? Kind of like what China has been doing for all these years. They have policy consistency and long-term goals. The U.S. does not. What about now?
Okay, so United States is a country of diverse political interest groups, and the country does not really act on unanimity of opinions. And you have so many political forces at play at any given moment. So when we say whole of government, and is not the same as whole of society. Government and society are separated in the United States because of democracy. I can tell you though, it is whole of government. When I was in the government under the Trump administration, virtually every agency of the United States government, federal government, had a very clear understanding of the danger the Chinese Communist Party posed to the United States. And I think, under the leadership of President Trump and particularly Secretary Pompeo in the State Department, our foreign policy has a very clear understanding of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and have a very clear understanding of what we're facing. So yes, there was a whole of government, but I have to qualify to say, to follow immediately though, that is, the United States government is limited in power because it is constitutional democracy. When we say whole of government, that doesn't necessarily mean that government can do whatever it wants. Right. We, as a government, cannot really tell, say, the companies in Silicon Valley what to do, what not to do, as long as they do not violate the U.S. laws. So I think, that is actually one of the major inadequacies of democracy, one of the challenges that democracy faces when dealing with totalitarian regimes. Right. The Chinese government, as you mentioned earlier, has total control of human and material resources. They could do a lot of things. Xi Jinping has been saying, 集中力量办大事. We can master all our forces and resources to do big things. And I think, that's a challenge. On the other hand, though, there's one advantage on our side. That is, this is a country of incredible creativity and ingenuity. Yes. We can all be one step, two steps ahead of our adversaries. And that has been proven true for the last 200 plus years. So we're not totally out of pace in our response to China. And I think, I remain very optimistic in that.
Okay, this is a very interesting area because people have been trying to compare whether a totalitarian regime using all their resources to the government decide which direction we should go in terms of innovation, industrial policies and stuff like that. Would that be a more effective approach than in a free society? In capitalism, you let the private sector to decide where you want to go. What do you think?
Free market system has enormous potential. It has a great advantage over non-market economy, a non-market oriented society. Having said that, And there is a precondition for free market to operate. That is, it has to be operate in an open society. Once you have the open society, you create opportunities for your adversaries to take advantage. Right? So, and that brings up another question, that is, how do you protect your vital industries? As a government, its primary responsibility is to protect your own critical industry and to protect your own people. And the most sort of pernicious danger to that kind of a lack of protection comes from China. China has been pilfering the technologies, particularly critical military, industrial, and trade secrets of the United States and technologies for decades. So it is absolutely imperative for the US government to immediately impose some kind of specific steps to protect ourselves. And I think the Trump administration did more than any other previous administrations in my memory. And I think we basically put so many critical infrastructure under our protection. And our FBIs and a lot of law enforcement agencies have stepped up its measures against Chinese espionage, against their military and industrial theft. And we also have enacted several self-protection trade policies. And President Trump basically said, you tariff, right? So that's actually protected a lot of American industries. We also forced China to follow certain rules that they promised it would. That's basically the essence of the phase one trade talk with China. It's not just about how much goods that Chinese should buy from America. It's actually about how China's systemic unfair policies and its institutional flaws affect the Chinese-U.S. economic and trade relationship. So we forced China to comply to that. And had there not been COVID, and we would have seen a tremendous progress in that regard, particularly when it comes to enforcement stage. So to answer the question in a very sort of detour way, yes, we have to do it, but first and foremost, we have to protect ourselves. So this protection is first step.
So, Dr. Yu, would you say on the level playing field, the American system with innovation, strong innovation, free economy, can outcompete the Chinese system?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, because an open system like the one the United States has can actually, number one, incentivize Chinese people. So that can unleash tremendous ingenuity and creativity. And so I think that Chinese people are also pursuing that. And that's one of the reasons why the Chinese economy has grown so much in the recent decades.
You are so right about that.
Yeah. So
that's the only thing you did.
The most important thing we have to keep in mind about Chinese economic system is that virtually the entire economic growth, comes from the private, non-state sectors. Yeah. So the government-run SOEs, almost none of them is actually profitable. So they're basically parasitical in a way. Even though we state monopoly with tremendous subsidies, and it still is not really performing. So in a free market system, in a level playing field, and those companies should not exist. And that's why private system, private entrepreneur system will ultimately triumph. This is basically the major ethos of modern history. Anybody that goes against that has failed. So what the Chinese government has done is to use state power to selectively promote non-performing sector under its total control and use the international free market system to reap the benefits of the free market system globally. And that's why if we take action collectively, say at WTO or the G7, and we basically try to stop the Chinese unfair practice, using its state subsidy, uses state power to monopolize certain trade, and then we'll win. So that's why you mentioned about the leveling the playing field. That's very important.
So in the end, you think the 举国体制 of China, how do you say it? The 举国体制 of China wouldn't succeed. For example, the Chinese government has supported Huawei so much, and they gave them all the resources and stuff like that. In the end, you think this approach won't work?
This approach won't work, and also definitely is actually against the international free market system. It should be stopped, right? So Huawei is a company with tremendous government support. And with that support, they can actually compete easily against its rivals globally. And so before long, they could easily just kick out Ericsson and Nokia and even Samsung from the global competition because they have a powerful government with enormous, almost unlimited economic backing, right? So that's not fair, and also it's against the fundamentals of a free market system. That should not be allowed. The U.S. learned a lesson early on. There's a ZTE, I think it's Chinese Zhongxin. ZTE was 100% owned by the Chinese government. And it did something wrong against U.S. law. So the U.S. government fined it with the enormous amount. And ZTE didn't care because they said, okay, we'll pay it. Mm-hmm. That's because it's not a company that pays the fine. It's the Chinese government that pays the fine. Right. So free market rule doesn't even apply to a state-sponsored economic operation. And that's why the Chinese economic system is fundamentally incompatible with global free market system. And that has to be changed. People have to address that from the macro level. We cannot continue pretending that China is a free market system. We can trade as if it's just one of many rivals. No major nation, no major Western industrial nation, no major international financial economic institution recognizes Chinese economy as a free market economy. And that's why we have to really apply our industrial and economic policies to conform with that reality, that fact that Chinese economy is not a free market economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so amazing how the world's view on China has changed since President Nixon visited China and China opened up in the 1970s. For decades, the world's consensus has been, the rise of China was good. Yeah. And that changed almost overnight to people. And I know you are in the midst of this. And tell me how this policy, this reorder of China policy came about.
Okay, so I think the world has tremendous good wishes for the Chinese people. The rise of China actually is a great thing for the world. You have so many people who are now better off. They're engaged in economic operations globally. And so I think we all benefit from that. So since Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972, the world has changed, as you said. Cold War is over. A global power realignment has occurred. So those were tremendous changes that we have embraced with great delight and glee. The coming of information age and the computer age and space, cyber, tremendous progress on the material level. But there are some also continuity and constancies that have not changed. And number one, the biggest consistency, biggest continuity is that China still is ruled by the same Marxist Leninist political party. That party still embraces and practices exactly the same kind of controlling dictatorial mechanism in China as if China has not changed, right? So the fundamentals of China's political system remains the same, despite the fact that materially, economically, China has changed dramatically. So this probably is one of the biggest irony of our times. And also, that irony is very clearly felt, not only in China, but increasingly is felt internationally. Because as China rises economically, China's model of governance, the fact that China is still ruled by a Marxist-Leninist party with a innate control urge to rule the country with iron fist, and with this normal and what they consider as a regular and a normative methods, such as propaganda, united front, party system, and population control, and all those things is now spilling over to the international arena. So that's why people were looking at the rise of China with tremendous sense of uncertainty and even fear, because China's marching into the global stage is also this. At the same time, it also brings to the world something that China has been doing domestically for decades. And that's something that we cannot really tolerate. And during the Trump administration, this was felt very clearly. And we abandoned the illusion, somehow, free market system in the world and the virtue of democracy would inspire the Chinese communist leadership to change, to be more liberal, to make it a more responsible stakeholder, as the cliche goes. And that is an absolute illusion, and has been dashed by not only the reality, but also by the rhetoric of the Chinese Communist Party. You listen to Xi Jinping, he has tremendous hubris, and his commitment to communist ideology is unshaken. He's talking every day in China about Wu Wang Cu Xin. Don't forget that your original commitment. What is the original commitment? Basically, is the communist ideology, the Chinese communist, Marxist, Leninist commitment to that kind of ideology, that to make China the leading force of the ultimate triumph of global socialism. He makes these speeches all over the places, and it is actually foolish for the world, for policymakers, to ignore that reality and that rhetoric. So this is something that we have to realize, and I think during the Trump administration, under the leadership particularly of Secretary Pompeo, we at the State Department had extensive discussion about all this, and I think we had a collective realization that something had to be done, and something had to be done because partly what we have been doing before had failed. Right. So that failure was not only recognized by the Republicans, but also by Democrats, right? Many of the Democrats who are now in power, in charge of Asian policy, were the first to come out and say, our engagement policy with China, with the hope that China would become more liberal, more like us, has failed. And that failure has cost them dearly. And now it's time for us to re-engage China from the totally different perspective. And we set up a new set of rules. Reciprocity, for example, is one of them. And we also focus on results, not just the banquet and dialogues. And so we see through that. And I think, we did a tremendous good to the American people.
Right. I'm just curious, when did you start to say China is still ruled by a Marxist Leninist power? Because I think just a few years ago, probably a big percentage of the American leadership or the world leadership would not buy that. They think, China's already changed. When did you start to say that and then people start to accept?
Well, we say that, when I went to the State Department, and I worked with Pompeo, and soon after that, we had some discussions, and he began to use those terms. It's a little bit surprising to me, because Americans were in general, averse to using terms like Marxist-Leninist Party to designate something that they were familiar during the Cold War. They had this unrealistic realization that with the downfall of the Berlin Wall, communism was over. Marxism-Leninism no longer fashionable. Now, I have to say, in China, that is true, because most people, majority of people in China, among the people, they don't believe in Marxism-Leninism anymore. They were very enthusiastically pursuing all the major status symbols of bourgeois lifestyle, right? Cars, housing, fancy clothes, and major Western brands of clothing and sportswear. So those things were basically what occupied ordinary Chinese people. But the Chinese people are powerless in China. The people in charge of the whole big country, the people who controls all the assets in China, is a very small, relatively small group of Chinese Communist Party elites. They are the die-hard believers of Marxism and Leninism. They are the ones who decide where the country goes. And they have total control of information. The information actually is very important for us to understand, because the information control, the firewall is so complete that ordinary Chinese people do not have a diverse sources of information frame to make their judgment very accurate. So they're bombarded with disinformation by the Chinese government propaganda machines. With that, obviously, their judgment inside China is not very, very accurate sometimes, particularly when it comes to issues like Uyghurs and like the U.S. true intention of engaging China. And so everything related to the United States is being misinterpreted and misinformed, deliberately misinformed, I would say. So they weaponize the information. And I think that's one of the things that we really have to make a distinction. On number one, the Chinese people no longer believe in Marxism or Leninism. On the other hand, the group of people that really matter in China do believe it. So that's why we make our policy, we talk about the Chinese Communist Party. You pay attention closely to what Secretary Pompeo's speeches when he was at the State Department. He always referred to the Chinese government as Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
The party controls the government. Yeah. That's very accurate. He always refers to Xi Jinping as General Secretary of Chinese Communist Party. He never calls him president. In the same way that we never call, during Reagan years, for example, President Reagan never called Gorbachev the president of Soviet Union. He was always General Secretary Gorbachev. And that's very accurate. And I think, we're not trying to ideologize the reality. We're just trying to describe the reality accurately. Right. That's what Xi Jinping is. So we based our China policy on something that's very accurate, somewhat realistic. And I think we did a good thing.
You mentioned President Reagan. I think what I think about President Reagan was, the Biden administration talks about, working with allies. And for majority of the people, I think they are all for working with allies. But I think working with allies and working with allies could be different. So you could have a Reagan mentality where you believe the Soviet Union is the evil empire, with the name of the game being we win, they lose. Or you could have another mentality where you think China is only a normal rival. So you compete with them in some areas and work with them in others. Yeah. When dealing with today's China, dealing with today's Communist Party of China, which mentality do you think we should adopt?
I think, President Reagan was a great president for a number of reasons. One of the most important ones, I think, is because of his ability to communicate with the American people some very fundamental truth, not only about America, but also about America's opponents, right, adversaries. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and he told Americans why. And that ability to communicate with the American people in unambiguous terms, and that's very important. And I think American presidents should really learn from him. That's why he was called a great communicator. So that's number one. Number two, about working with allies. The funny thing is, if we keep talking about working with allies, we may run a risk of shirking Americans' responsibility as a leader of world democracies. For whatever reason, you like it or not, America is a country of consequence. We are a big country. We lead in the world in many, many ways, not just economic, not just the military powers, but also we are the most outspoken country against human rights violations globally. We're the country that was most generous whenever there is a natural disasters in the world that occur. We're the country that use our tremendous commitment to global peace to make sure that bloodshed will be minimized, right? So our outreach is global. If we keep talking about working with allies, sometimes people just use it as an excuse not to lead. Not to decide. We have to be really cognizant of the Americans' leadership role. And the world has to have the United States at the forefront for freedom. And this is basically the history of the world for the last over 100 years has proven this, right? So we have to work with allies, but we have to take the lead.
Right, you have to balance those two.
You have to balance the two. Allies are enormously important for us. And it is also a complete misstatement. It's a wrong idea that somehow the Trump administration totally abandoned our allies. We didn't. We tried to convince our allies that China poses the most dangerous threats to Western democracy, to international system. Because President Trump had the unique personality, many of our allies did not really like him. So they confused what Americans' message with the messenger, and that is President Trump. So they instinctively resist our call to face the China challenge, which was global. So it's not only to us, it's to them too. So we spend quite a bit of efforts to basically talk to our allies to clarify our position. And in the end, after the outbreak of the COVID, and more allies took our side, and they came around. And so we probably did more in sort of putting allies together to face China challenge. So much so, at the time of the power transfer in January 2021, I should say, our major allies, particularly our NATO allies, have issued really major statements and taken specific actions to join us in combating the China threat. You have NATO leaders talking about how to get involved in this peace and security in Asia Pacific, in South China Sea. We did that, right? So working with allies is good, but we have to understand that America has to take the leadership role. Number two, allies are important, but the allies, they have their own domestic policies. They have their own national interests. Many of the allies want to cozy up to the Chinese so they could have a sizable market share when the U.S. standing up really tough on China. So many of the allies were very opportunistic, right? They don't necessarily go along with us on China policy. So, which comes to my second point, that is, when we're working with allies, we have to conduct American first policy. So we have to work with ally in dealing with our common mission to combat the common threats. We did this during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. We're now dealing with China, right? Chinese Communist Party. But America has our national interests too. So we must really take care of America first. Many of our allies, they work with China against our interest. So we have to be very careful on blindly championing, working with allies unconditionally. So that's why America first is always the first principle of the U.S. government operation. That should be. And I think we did that, obviously. I hope the new administration will also keep that in mind, even though they don't want to say it. But listen, they represented American voters. So I mean, we should all carry out America first.
That said, what are the common misunderstandings of the American First policy from our allies?
Well, I think the biggest misunderstanding that American First policy is equal to isolationism. It's not. America First doesn't necessarily mean that America is going to isolate itself. America First is not the same as America only. We cannot really completely extricate ourselves from the global affairs. So, because America, as I say, is a global leader in many, many aspects of our common life, right? Not just the military, we're all over the world, but also economic engagement, right? Our American companies are all over the place. Google, Facebook, Twitter, they're global companies, multinationals. So we cannot really completely extricate ourselves from global affairs, number one. For political purposes, for domestic political reasons, there's always the labeling of the America first as isolationism. That's not true. So that's the biggest misunderstanding from my perspective.